For our Data 301 video, our group is going to be looking over a data set called Student Performance on Exams. It contains marks secured by students in 3 categories, being math, reading, and writing. It focuses on standardized testing. Our data is under a CCO public domain license, meaning that we're able to use it for this project. And our goal for the project is to explore correlation between test grades and other factors offered in this data set to find biases that exist in the world of standardized testing, since standardized testing is used all over the world and it is often a make or break for many people getting into schools. And yeah, so we're just looking at the correlation between that and other factors. So starting with my dashboard, I'm looking at the correlation between parental level of education and their child's performance on standardized exams. So I'm going to start with, so that is my research question. And then my personal connection with that is just that my parents never got bachelor's degrees. So I thought that's an interesting correlation. Just look at how parental education actually can affect how students do on standardized testing, just often because then their parents can't really help them out with test preparation, and they are often the first in their family going through like the same experience. So I'm going to first look at this stacked bar visualization. What I've done here is I've separated the math, reading, and writing scores. And one of my first observations from that is that the median scores, it's categorized from some high school, some college, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, then master's degree. So the correlation I noticed here is that as the parents are more educated, the median score in every subject increases. So what I found here is it doesn't matter what subject, there seems to be the correlation on average for all the subjects. So then what I decided to do is I created a box and whispers plot and a bubbles plot, just looking over the median and average scores here, because since my first plot really showed that it didn't matter looking at the individual scores, I thought that I would make a variable for a median score. So again, it just shows that as the education increases, the average score goes up. And then the box and whispers plot shows very similar things. It also shows, it's also important here to like look at the median, because even though the median and mean are very similar for this data set, sometimes that's not the case, and the median ignores outliers, which aren't really too good to look at in this type of data analysis. As well, the standard deviation even shows that as education increases, the marks increase on the upper and lower quartiles. And lastly, I'm going to go over the circle view, which I actually did a little bit differently than the rest of my analysis. I put it into 3 categories to be more situational. So I'll just first explain the median. So I just have the median just showing how, yes, the education does increase, average scores go up. But now something interesting I looked into was the bottom 5% average. So these are the bottom 5% performers on average. And as you can see, some high school, some college, associate's degree, and then once you have bachelor's/master's degree, the average score becomes a little bit higher, but all these are failing on average for the bottom 5%. So what that means is often if a child's parent doesn't have education, they're more likely to actually fail their exams, which is, if this is a school exam or an exam for a class that needs to be passed, they won't be passing, which often means they won't be able to finish their education and the cycle can continue on, which is an interesting takeaway. So kind of shows that, like, based on these standardized testing, it can often cause a repetitive cycle. And then the top 5 averages is interesting to look at, because these are often the people who get into the best schools and are just the top achievers. And again, it shows correlation that a master's degree, bachelor's degree, associate's degree does better than some high school, and some college. So yeah, that's my findings from my data.
Look at is whether or not there is a correlation between gender and how they perform on different test standardized tests. And the reason why I'm exploring this topic is because as a female student, this hits way too close to me. And growing up, I always was taught that guys are smarter than girls. And I want to be able to debunk this myth because obviously since the patriarchy exists, there are a lot of false expectations placed on female students, and I want to be able to empower females to think that they are smart, and I don't want males to keep thinking that they are smarter in most situations, and they shouldn't have lower expectations because someone is a female. So based off the graphs that we see here, we are looking at a side-by-side graph over here. We can see that males perform on average a bit better than females. You can see that they perform 63%, whereas males perform 70%. But for the other subjects, which are reading, writing, and the average of the total of those scores, you can see that females do perform better. So you can see the total average 68.6% and males get 67%. So on average, you can see that also in the box and whisker plots that males do perform better in math. So you can see that they have a shorter range, whereas females have a larger range when it comes to math. However, for reading and writing, they have relatively very similar scores. However, females do perform a bit better when it comes to average. And I also look at the different the total number of students per sex, and this is a relatively good data set to work with because it is relatively equal, and you can see that there's a bit of a difference when it comes to the total average and females performing a bit higher. So our biggest takeaway out of all of this data is that basically we shouldn't generalize an entire sex because it is obviously dangerous. Having these stereotypes placed on females, it discourages them in the workforce, especially in tech, and looking at this, I'm really curious to see if there's any psychological and sociological impacts when it comes to how they perform on different standardized tests. But in general, this is a very interesting thing to look at, and I really hope there's more research on it in the future.
For my portion of the project, I explored the disparity between standardized test scores of different racial and ethnic groups. I wanted to find out whether the completion of test preparation courses had impacted people's scores and whether there was a disparity in how many people per racial group had completed these test preparation courses. Going right into it, at the bottom left of my screen, there is a picked bubble graph which represents the amount of people per race who are represented in the dataset. To the right of that, there is a pie chart which represents the amount of people per racial group who had completed test preparation courses. In both graphs, you can see groups 3 and 4 are highly represented and groups 1 and 5 are not so. Above that, there is a bar graph which shows a comparison of total test score averages per race in relation to whether they had completed test preparation courses or not. As you can see, certain racial groups performed better than the others. To the right of that, there is a side-by-side circle graph which shows subject-specific averages for different racial groups. A trend that is visible throughout the graph is that for people who had completed test preparation courses, they had performed above the others. However, I think it is also important to note that although Group 3 was highly represented, it did not perform as well as the others did. Going into the data set, I wanted to find out if there was a difference in standardized test scores for people from different races. Furthermore, I wanted to know if certain racial groups tended to have more test prep and how that affected their scores. After doing my research, I can conclude that there is indeed a disparity in the amount of people who were completing test preparation courses per racial group, and as such, there is a disparity in the scores of people who had completed these standardized tests.
Overall, this dataset was really interesting to look at because we were able to see the correlations between sociological and psychological factors that impact test performance. And these are really important datasets to us because as university students, we understand that there could be a lot more research done on all this. And we really hope other people explore these topics because there are a lot of factors that do impact test performance.